Okay, so this is the second review video for Peerceptiv. This one isn't going to be as long because I've already gone over the basic structure of the overview, explanation, and application. The purpose of this one is mostly to show you the difference between a consecutive and a clustered organization. So you'll see that the reviewing pane over to the left on your screen, like that's all got the same comments that I had in it before. Because this is really the exact same analysis. It's just organized somewhat differently once you get to the explanations and the applications. So it's got all the same formatting. So the formatting, ooh, wait, what happened? Oh, there it is. Okay. So the formatting is the same. Notice that this is a clustered rather than a consecutive, and it still fits within 3 pages. And to be honest, I didn't have to do a lot of editing to get it into the 3 pages. I was over by about 2 lines. And so I had to go back in and do a little bit of editing to make it fit on 3 pages. I probably could go back in and maybe make it a little bit more streamlined, pick up a couple more lines. But it does fit comfortably in 3 pages with a full thorough analysis using all 3 cases. Okay, so the overview paragraph is the same that we looked at in the first video. The rule explanation paragraphs are a little bit different. So instead of all the rule explanations first and then all the applications, this gives rule explanation and then the rule application that follows it. So here we've just got one piece of the rule. A mixed-use building is a dwelling when it is usually occupied. So then it goes through and gives the information in Quattlebaum. Now this is the exact same information from Quattlebaum that you had in the other organization. in the other organization. When you get down to the prosecution, the defense, and the court, though, you're just going to talk about usually occupied overnight because we've clustered it. We've got one cluster of E's and A's with usually occupied overnight, and then a second cluster of E's and A's with the threat of violence. So this application only covers usually occupied at night. So the prosecution will argue that Pizza Parma building was usually occupied overnight, and then it's got the exact same comparisons from the last one. Unlike the offices in Quattlebaum, which were not outfitted for regular overnight use and were not used primarily for sleeping, the residential apartments above Pizza Parma were. Although they were not occupied on the night of the burglary, they were still residential in nature, unlike the offices in Quattlebaum. I could make that clearer by saying although the apartments above Pizza Parma were not occupied on the night of the burglary. Unlike the offices in Quattlebaum, which were used fewer than 30 times per year at most, the apartments above Pizza Parma had been occupied full time and would be again after renovations were completed and vacations were over. So that's it. That's the entire application for usually occupied overnight. And notice that it handles Quattlebaum. Quattlebaum's the other case. Now, this is something you might not have expected. The defense doesn't have to win on everything. The defense only has to win on one thing. Because remember, the prosecution has to prove both that it was usually occupied overnight and that there was a threat of violence similar to the threat of violence raised by burglary of a dwelling. The defense only has to poke a hole in one of those things, which means the defense doesn't have to win everything, and the defense shouldn't make foolish arguments. And so there were some arguments you could make for the defense, but there's also no reason that you couldn't concede this. So here, the defense does not have a reasonable argument that the residential apartments were not usually occupied at night. Therefore, the prosecution argument is the more persuasive, and therefore the residential apartments above the restaurant should be considered usually occupied at night. I have a little bit of therefore build up. I would probably take one of those out. And then, so that's the first cluster. Usually occupied explanation, usually occupied application, prosecution, defense, court conclusion. Because the defense position was just one sentence, the court conclusion was just going to be one sentence, it's okay to put those in one paragraph. So now you start the next cluster, and the next cluster involves the threat of violence. So again, you have the rule explanation paragraph starting with rule thesis sentences. A burglary poses a threat of violence when it is when the building, not it, when the building is relatively small and when the sleeping quarters and burglary site are remote enough from one another that the sleeping quarters are not accessible to the burglar. And then the next one However, a burglar with greater access to sleeping quarters than that in Joseph does burglarize a building. And so you've got sort of a transition between Joseph and McCrae there. So you've got the exact same rule explanations that you had in the consecutive organization. It's just now they're separated from usually occupied at night, and they provide bookends on this rule about the threat of violence. So the first case showing where it was not a dwelling because there was not the threat of violence. The second case, McCrae, showing where there was a threat of violence and therefore it was a dwelling. Notice also in these that most of these paragraphs are building description, because you've got to understand what the building setup was to understand accessibility and remoteness. And so you've got to spend some time talking about how these buildings were set up. And if you do that, then the reasoning that the court gives is usually pretty brief, because it's just sort of pulling that information together and applying the law to it. And then again, after you have those two cases on threat of violence, you have prosecution, defense, and then conclusion. Here, the defense has a really good argument on accessibility and remoteness. And so you've got the prosecution argument on remoteness and accessibility. And then the defense argument is actually, it's pretty solid to the extent that I think on this argument, I think the defense is the better of the two. And so ultimately, my conclusion was, based on this document that I drafted, my conclusion was that the defense would actually probably win, and that the court would find that second-degree burglary was an excessive charge and that it should have been third-degree burglary instead. So the defense lost nothing by conceding usually occupied at night, because the defense had a really strong case here with accessibility. And then finally, the conclusion, which brings things back to burglary. Because the prosecution will likely be unable to prove that Beckwith burglarized a dwelling, the charge of second-degree burglary is excessive. The charge should be reduced to third-degree burglary, which only requires proof that he entered lawfully and intended to commit a crime. Okay, so that's the clustered organization. Now, obviously, you're not going to look for documents that follow this exactly, but these are the types of paragraphs that you need. This is the type of order that you want them in. And so this is sort of your comparison point. Now, while I did draft the clustered and the consecutive organization, I actually used, for purposes of efficiency, I used a student document as my starting point, and read through and kind of looked at what the arguments were that they pulled together, and then I just wrote it in two different organizational structures. But the arguments were arguments that were made by a student in your class on this initial discussion. I didn't want to present you with arguments that I had come up with before you guys submitted the assignment, because I wanted you to see that the arguments that were made in these documents were arguments that you could have come up with in your first semester, that this wasn't impossible to attain. And in fact, these two drafts aren't super different than the draft that inspired them. Or actually, it was a couple of drafts that I used to sort of go from. Okay, so the next video is going to be me going through a student document. And it's a student who's consented to me using the document for these purposes. It's a well-written student document, but you'll get a little better sense of how to do the ratings when things don't go exactly the way they need to go. Okay.